In 737 AD, the Muslim wars with the Khazars came to an end. According to Arab sources, the Turks promised to convert to Islam, but in 744 AD, they instead converted to Judaism. This conversion assured the Turks of a sovereign state free from the influence of Christianity or Islam. Nothing really worth mentioning concerning the Khazars' history took place over the next century after their conversion. However, in 750 AD, the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown by the Abbasids, a powerful Muslim dynasty whose reign lasted 500 years. During the reign of the Abbasids, Islam would go on to reach its peak. In 758 AD, Yazid ibn Yusid, Abbasid governor of Armenia, entered into a marriage alliance with the Khazars. This alliance would have made the Turkish state allies with the growing Islamic power, but the deal didn't go as planned and ended in a small battle that forced the Abbasid Caliph Mansur to release 7,000 prisoners, whom he instructed to swiftly build a fortification to block the advance of the Khazars. This event indicates a strong Turkic state around 758 AD, who the Arabs hoped to be on good terms with. For the next few decades, the history of the Turks was silent. In Arthur Kohlhessler's book, The 13th Tribe, he tells us that around 830 AD, the Khazars requested assistance from the Byzantines in building a fortress along the Don River. Theophilus, who was the East Roman emperor at the time, sent a naval unit across Cherson and the Sea of Azov and up the mouth of the Don River to the territory of the Khazars. Here, Turk and Byzantine architects built a military fortress that came to be known as Sarkel. Its name in the Turkic tongue means white bricks, since the bricks were made from white limestone. Other chroniclers who wrote about Sarkel called it the White Tower or the White House. What's most interesting about the fortress is the bricks used to construct it. These bricks were decorated with Turkic tribal symbols and what appears to me to be Jewish symbols of the menorah. This symbol was found all over former Khazar settlements in the region of modern-day Ukraine. The fortress of Sarkel was mostly inhabited by Khazars, Slavs, and Bulgars, and it was guarded by up to 300 Turkic guards at one time. The fortress only served as a military fortification for a couple of decades until it was overrun by traders and craftsmen from all over the region. The location of Sarkel was a highly valuable archaeological site until it was flooded in 1952 during the construction of a reservoir in Russia. An excerpt from Khazaria.com tells us this: of all the excavated Khazarian cities, the one which provided the richest material remains was Sarkel, which was flooded in 1952 upon the completion of the new Semliaski Reservoir. Archaeological work at the Sarkel site was never fully completed, and it is not possible to conduct further studies. Nevertheless, the existing data recovered from Sarkel provides valuable clues to the Khazarian culture. So, unfortunately, the remains of the site lay under the waters of the Semliask Reservoir. Scholars are not sure who the Khazars were defending themselves from when building the fortress. Some sources say it was the Magyars, who we will touch on here shortly. Other sources say they were defending themselves from the Vikings, whose history is intertwined with that of the Khazars. During the construction of the fortress of Sarkel, they emerged on the world scene as a formidable force, and their fascinating history takes us into the Viking Age. The Vikings were a group of people who in the late 8th century AD left their homeland of Scandinavia and set out to explore the New World. They were notorious for their plundering, piracy, and raiding throughout all of Europe, where they not only raided, but would eventually settle. Their voyages reached as far as the Middle East, Africa, Greenland, and even North America and the region of modern-day Canada. Their homeland, Scandinavia, was an ancient region that included the areas of modern Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Some may also include Finland in this category. There were two different branches of Vikings, an eastern and a western branch. The Vikings who left Denmark and Norway and raided Western Europe were called the Danes and Norse, or Norsemen. Danes because they came from Denmark, and Norse because they came from Norway. These groups were also known as the Western Vikings. The other group of Vikings who came from Sweden migrated east. Their raids reached Eastern Europe and Western Russia, all the way to the Middle East and Africa. The Arabs called them Varangians, but others called them the Rus, or the Rus. And these are the Vikings that would go on to create the Turkic dynasty, the first major dynasty in early Russian history. The Viking Age lasted from about 800 AD to 1050 AD. After this branch left their homeland in Scandinavia, they began targeting and attacking Christian monasteries in the British Isles around 789 AD. A monastery is defined as a building or a group of buildings occupied by a community of monks under religious vows. These monasteries were often secluded on small islands or isolated locations, so they could devote themselves to worship without the interference of other elements in society. The monasteries here in Europe were occupied by Christians, and their isolation away from the public made them vulnerable to attacks from the Vikings. These series of attacks took place in 793, 794, 795, and 802 AD. In 806 AD, the Vikings attacked a monastery in Iona off the west coast of Scotland and killed 68 people. After this devastation, the community of Iona abandoned the site and fled to Kells, Ireland. Later on, the Vikings would also come to Ireland where they attacked coastal territories, and in 840 AD, they founded the city of Dublin in Ireland. What made these warriors different from the other groups in the known world was their disrespect of Christianity. It was almost an unwritten rule in the Christian era to show a certain level of dignity and respect for Christians. This is why most nations, including the Khazars, forbade the enslavement of Christians. But the Vikings, they were different. They were not Christians and they had no respect for religious institutions, as they themselves had not yet been introduced to monotheism. Europeans seen the Vikings as uncivilized outsiders, and we can be sure that many attempts to convert them to Christianity were soon to take place. After the Western Vikings founded the city of Dublin, Ireland, their next big campaign took place in 844 AD in Muslim-ruled Seville, Spain. In October of that year, 44 longboats rowed their way up the Guadalquivir River and landed on the bank of the edge of the Umayyad Caliphate. Within minutes, hundreds of Vikings had disembarked and rushed the unfortified city, wielding their axes and screaming war cries. As more Viking raiders arrived, they spent the entire week plundering and looting while the citizens fled to the nearby town of Carmona. Meanwhile, the Muslims, led by Abd al-Rahman II, sent for reinforcements, and in early November, they fought back. This defense repelled the Vikings, as many of them fled, and the rest of them were captured and executed in front of their compatriots. These Vikings would return 14 years later, only to be repelled once more by the Muslim army. This is just a quick glance at the Vikings that raided Western Europe. These attacks took place between the periods of 783 AD to 1060 AD, mostly in England. Outside of England, the Vikings took over and settled in Iceland, the Faroes, and Orkney, 3 areas located just north of Scotland. Here they would eventually become farmers and fishermen. From Orkney, they ruled most of Scotland, and to this day, many Scottish people still possess Viking names. During these 300 years of attacks on Western Europe, many Danes, which are the Vikings from Denmark, and Norsemen, which are the Vikings from Norway, they prospered and permanently settled in England and France and became a part of the mix of people who make up the British people today. The Vikings in France founded what is today called Normandy, France. That is because it was founded by the Norse Vikings from Norway. Now that we have mentioned the Western Vikings, we are able to establish a difference between them and their eastern branch, called the Rus Vikings or Varangians. Sometime in between 838 to 850 AD, these Vikings left Scandinavia, seeking to settle in other parts of the world. By this time, their western branch, the Danes and the Norse, had already begun raiding Europe. The Varangians crossed the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Finland and arrived in the region of Lake Ladoga, where some sources say they created a temporary settlement. They then sailed up the Volkhov River into Lake Ilmen, where they found a convenient island. On this island, they built a settlement which eventually grew into the city of Novgorod. Novgorod at that time was inhabited by Slavic tribes, but they were soon subjugated by the Vikings. The primary Russian chronicle, also known as the Primary Chronicle, is a chronicle concerning the history of Kievan Rus, this region right here, which is today called Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. The primary Russian chronicle records the history that took place in this region from 850 to 1110 AD. It is said to have been written by Nestor the chronicler. According to the chronicle, East Slavic and Finnic tribes drove the Varangians, that is, the Vikings, back beyond the sea, refused to pay them tribute, and set out to govern themselves. But in 862 AD, the Slavic tribes around Novgorod experienced internal disorder and conflict, so they decided to invite the Varangians back to rule over them and reinstate order and peace. The Varangians, led by Rurik, came back to Novgorod and ruled over the Slavs. This rule marked the beginning of the Rurikid dynasty, which some see as the first dynasty in Russian history and the first embodiment of modern Russia. After leaving Scandinavia, Novgorod was the center of power for the Varangian Rus. Concerning the city of Novgorod, one Arab chronicler wrote, "In this island, there are men to the number of 100,000, and these men constantly go out to raid the Slavs in boats, and they seize the Slavs and take them prisoner, and they go to the Khazars and Bulgars and sell them there. They have no cultivated land or seed and live by plunder from the Slavs." We could take multiple things from this account. This source confirms what we mentioned in an earlier episode as far as the Khazars' involvement in the slave trade. The Varangian Rus constantly raided the Slavs and took them prisoners and sold them to the Khazars and Bulgars. This Arab source mentions that the Vikings have no cultivated land and simply live by plunder from other nations. During this same period, while Rurik ruled in Novgorod, two of his men, Oskald and Dur, around 860 AD, traveled down the Dnieper River and stumbled across a fortified place they liked. They were told by the inhabitants that this place was Kiev, and it paid tribute to the Khazars. Oskald and Dur were fond of the town, so they created a settlement here with their families and gathered many Northmen with them, and they ruled over the Slavs. What's important about this history is we are beginning to see the Varangian Rus slowly interfere with the sovereignty of the Khazar state by creating settlements in lands that are subject to the Khazars. The inhabitants of Kiev told Oskar and Dur that they paid tribute to the Khazars, but the Varangians decided to settle there anyways. According to the primary Russian chronicle, during this period, the tribute from the Slavonic peoples was divided between the Khazars and the Varangians. The Varangians levied tribute on the Chud and the Krivintians, which were the northern Slavonic people, while the Khazars continued to levy tribute on the Viatici, Sivian, and the Poliani, and the central region of Kiev. But eventually, the state of Kiev and the Slavs would be fully subjugated by the Rus. The history just discussed took place around 860 AD. Later that year, Oskald and Dur, the same man who settled in Kiev, led a fleet of around 200 to 230 ships across the Black Sea and laid siege to Constantinople. The Byzantines called these Varangian Vikings the Rus, which is said to have derived from an Old Norse term for men who row, because the Vikings were known for rowing in their boats along rivers. This attack took the Greeks by surprise, and St. Photius, who was a famous church leader and intellectual of Constantinople, described the attack as a thunderbolt from heaven. The accounts for this history vary, and it is not necessary to bring all the accounts into agreement at this time. The general consensus is that the Byzantine Emperor Michael III was away fighting the Abbasid Caliphate at the time, so the empire was mostly undefended. After landing, the Rus went on a rampage, setting homes and churches on fire, as well as drowning and stabbing the residents. Subsequently, they retreated for some unknown reason. This account confirms what we mentioned earlier, as far as the Vikings having no respect for religious institutions. A couple of decades later, Rurik, the Varangian leader who established a settlement in Novgorod, died in 879 AD. He was succeeded by his kinsman, Oleg. Oleg sailed down the Dnieper River and arrived at the town of Kiev. If we may recall, this was the town that Oskald and Dur settled in and began to subjugate the Slavs, who were then subject to the Khazars. According to the primary Russian chronicle, here Oleg executed Oskald and Dur and conquered the state of Kiev. The state of Kiev and its inhabitants, who were mostly Slavs, were now officially fully subject to the Rus. This was an enormous blow to the Khazar Empire, as Kiev eventually overshadowed Novgorod and became the capital of the Rus Vikings, also known as the Varangians. Despite the interference of Khazar operations by the Rus, over the next couple of decades, sources mention the trade relations between the two parties. As we mentioned in an earlier episode, Adel, the capital of Khazaria, was one of the main centers of trade where merchants came from all over the known world to exchange goods or sell slaves. The Khazars were able to impose a 10% tax on all cargo that passed through their land from Byzantium to the Muslim lands. The Rus Vikings maintained good trade relations with the Khazars while they plundered the Eastern Roman Empire. Earlier, we reviewed an Arab account that mentioned how the Rus sold slaves to the Khazars and the Bulgars. Reviewing this history will give us a better understanding as to why the Byzantines agreed to help the Khazars construct the military fortress Sarkel in Khazaria. After all, they were allies. The creation of Sarkel enabled the Khazars to restrict the Rus vessels along the Don River. If the Khazars didn't allow the Rus fleet to pass through, it would have greatly hindered the economic growth and trade of the emerging state of the Rus. In Arthur Koestler's book, The 13th Tribe, on page 143, he tells us that since the approach to the Caspian Sea, also known as the Khazar Sea, along the Volga River, and the approach to the Black Sea along the Don River were controlled by the Khazars, the Rus had to pay a 10% tax to pass through. The fortress of Sarkel was able to help secure the commerce activities for the Khazars, and it was a hindrance to the Rus' ascent to power, and this is something that they, the Eastern Vikings, were soon to deal with. It is crucial that we stop here and discuss a vital piece of Khazar history, and that is their historical connection with the Magyars. Looking from the bigger picture, we can see that Kiev and the Slavs played a significant role in the western flank of the Khazar state. After the nation was subjugated by the Varangians, it was up to the Magyars to be a buffer to the western region of the Khaganate. We will now go back in time to discuss the historical connection of the Magyars with the Khazars. According to Arthur Koestler, in his book The 13th Tribe, he says that at an unknown date during the early centuries of the Christian era, we can just assume sometime between 100 to 400 AD. During this period, the Magyars were driven out of their habitat in the Ural Mountains, and they migrated southward through the steppes. Eventually, they settled in the region between the Black and Caspian Sea. Here, the Magyars became the neighbors of the Khazars before the Turks rise to prominence. The Khazars emerged on the world scene in the early 7th century and became allies with the Byzantines around 627 AD. Later that century, around 650 AD, the Magyars were subject to the Khazars. The Magyars were subject and paid tribute to the Khazars all the way to the end of the 9th century. The Russian Chronicle and Arab sources inform us that throughout this period, the Magyars also exacted tribute on the Khazars' behalf from the Slav and Finn peoples north of the Magyars, a region notorious for being a source of slaves. We will now fast forward to 830 AD, around the time that the Khazar fortress Sarkel was built. Around this time, another major migration took place among the Magyars. They moved west, where they resettled here in between the Don and Dnieper rivers, right here above the Black Sea. The Byzantines called this region Lebedia, which was named after Ledbedi, who was known as the first ruler among the Magyars. The reason for this resettlement is controversial, but Arnold J. Toynbee, English historian and philosopher, says that the Magyars acted as agents for the Khazars, and that this resettlement was a part of the Khazar strategy to inhibit the movements of the emerging Rus. We just discussed how the Byzantines called this newly settled land of the Magyars Lebedia, after the first ruler of the Magyars, Ledbedi. The history concerning this resettlement was recorded by Constantine VII in his work, De Administrando. First, we will quote Constantine, and then we will analyze his account. The Magyars consisted of 7 hordes, but at that time they had no ruler, either native or foreign. But there were certain chieftains among them, of which the principal chieftain was the aforementioned Lebedius. The Khagan, the ruler of the Khazars, on account of the Magyars' military assistance, gave their first chieftain, the man called Lebedius, a noble Khazar lady as wife, that he may beget children of her. But Lebedius, by some chance, had no family by that Khazar woman. After some time had passed, the Khagan told the Magyars to send him their first chieftain. So Lebedius, coming before the Khagan of Khazaria, asked him for the reason why he had sent for him. And the Khagan said to him, "We have sent for you for this reason, that since you are well-born and wise and brave and the first of the Magyars, we may promote you to be the ruler of your race, and that you may be subject to our laws and orders." This account was given to us by Constantine VII. Ledvedi declined the offer to become a puppet ruler of the Khazars, but he suggested two other candidates of the Magyars, Almas or his son, Arpad. The Khazars' primary goal was to acquire an alliance with the Magyars, so Ledvedi's decline in suggestion of another candidate pleased the Turks, and they sent Ledvedi back to his people with escorts. Here, a ceremony of Arpad's installation took place in the fashion and custom of the Khazars. What we can conclude from this history is that the first ruler of the Magyars was a puppet king installed by the Khazars. This history took place around the same time that the Rus were emerging on the scene and beginning to invade the subjects of the Khazars. The placement of the Magyars in this region would slow down the Rus from expanding east towards the Khazar Empire. After these events, a civil war took place in the Khazar Empire. It was more like a group of rebels rebelling against the Khazarian government. Constantine VII also recorded this event, and he tells us that the rebels consisted of a confederation of 3 different Khazar tribes known as Khazars. These Khazars revolted against their government, but they were defeated and slaughtered. The remaining insurgents fled Khazaria and settled west with the Magyars. Constantine said when he wrote this that the Magyars and the Khazars spoke the same language. These Khazars became the leaders among the Magyars since they were more manly and efficient in wars. The reason this history is important is because these events took place after the Khazars' conversion to Judaism. Some of these Khazars who settled with the Magyars were Jews, and they brought the practice of Judaism to the Magyars. Soviet historian and archaeologist Macaulay Artimonov and Hungarian historian Antel Bartha, please forgive me if I mispronounce those names. But these archaeologists and historians have suggested that the revolt that was led by the Khazars against their own nation was a reaction against the reforms initiated by King Obadiah. In an earlier episode, we discussed how King Obadiah reformed the rule in Khazaria and reinforced Judaism. During these reformations, the Khazars transitioned from an ancient form of Judaism to a more orthodox form. This means they began to accept other authorities than just the Bible. As a result of these reforms, 3 Khazar tribes, known as Khazars, rebelled against their government and fled west and settled with the Magyars. Although it cannot be proven, historians believe these Khazars did not agree with Orthodox Judaism, so they fled west and settled with the Magyars. The reason these Khazar tribes migrated west is disputable. But what is not disputable is the fact that there were Jews among the Khazar tribes that settled with the Magyars. The influence of the Khazars on the Magyars is indicated in the passage given to us from Saint Cyril, the apostle of the Slavs. He tells us about an encounter he had with the Magyars. He was saying his prayers when they rushed at him, howling in the manner of wolves. This was a method that the Khazars were known for using in war to play with the enemy's head. We discussed this method in a previous episode. What's important to note is that the Magyars were not Turks, but here we see them using Turkic strategies in battle. That's because the influence the Khazar tribes had on them. So from all this history, there's a few things we can conclude. The first ruler of the Magyars was subject to the Khazars. Khazar tribes known as Khazars settled with the Magyars and taught the language of the Khazars to the Magyars. Among these Khazars, there were Jews from the Judaized empire of Khazaria, and the Magyars were influenced by the Khazar tribes so much that they adopted some of their military strategies. All of these events took place in the 9th century, and this explains to us how Judaism made its way into Eastern Europe. At the close of the 9th century, the Pechenegs emerged on the scene and attacked the Magyars in 896 AD. This attack resulted in another westward migratory movement by the Magyar and Khazar tribes. These two groups cut ties with the Khazars and permanently settled in a region where they would later become known as the Hungarians. Arpad, the puppet king of the Magyars that was installed by the Khazars, would later create a dynasty in Hungary that lasted until 1301 AD. Arthur Kohessler, who is an Hungarian himself, says that in the Hungarian school system, Arpad is actually one of the first names they teach children. What this reveals to us is how instrumental the Khazars were in the history of Hungary, and how Hungary and the rest of Eastern Europe became so associated with Judaism. This is a subject we will expound on more in detail soon, but it gives us clues as to how the Yahudim, or the Jews, magically turned into Europeans from Hebrews. The westward migratory movements just mentioned of the Khazar and Magyar tribes are just a few of the many movements that would eventually give Eastern Europe its Jewish population. The Pechenegs, whom the Byzantines called Pechenegs, were a semi-nomadic tribe of Turkic people who occupied the region between the Volga River and the Ural Mountains. While in this area, they were subject to the Khazars. IBN Rusta informs us that the Khazars raided the Pechenegs every year to collect tribute due to them. The Pechenegs were known as mercenaries that could be hired to attack other nations. Constantine VII describes them in this manner: an insatiably greedy lot of barbarians, who, for good money, can be bought to fight other barbarians and the Rus. So these Pechenegs were sometimes hired out to fight against the Rus. Although they fought with the Rus, they also traded with them. The Pechenegs sold cattle, sheep, and horses to the Rus, while they sold hides and wax to the Byzantine colonies in the Crimea. The ruling class of the Pechenegs spoke Iranian, while the general population spoke Turkic. They also practiced Turkic religions like shamanism, which is something we spoke about earlier when discussing the religion of the Khazars. But the primary religion of the Pechenegs was Manichaeism, which is a Persian religion that is a mixture of Christianity and paganism that was founded in the 3rd century AD. As always, many attempts were made to convert these Pechenegs to Christianity, but they failed, as the Pechenegs would eventually convert to Islam in the 11th century AD. The reason for discussing the emergence of the Pechenegs is because their attacks on the Magyars resulted in the westward migration of the Magyars to their permanent location, which they later called Hungary. Around 896 AD, the Pechenegs were attacked by their neighbors, the Oghuz Turks, also known as the Guz, or Guz Turks. As a result, these Pechenegs migrated west. They tried to settle in Khazaria, but the Khazars made war against them and repelled them. This history is confirmed by Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, who said, "The Guz and the Turks made war on the Pechenegs." By the Turks, Constantine means the Khazars, whom, with the help of the Guz, made war against the Pechenegs. After leaving Khazaria, these Pechenegs continued moving west until they ran into the territory of the Magyars. This is when they displaced the Magyars, resulting in the Magyar migration into present-day Hungary. While situated in this region, some sources, like the Hurad al-Alam, a 10th century geography book, identified the Pechenegs as the Khazarian Pechenegs. Page 160 of this geography book tells us this: these people, that is, the Khazarian Pechenegs, were formerly a group of the Pecheneg Turks. They came here, took the country by conquest, and settled down in it. They owned felt hunts and tents, cattle and sheep. They wander within the same territory on the grazing grounds situated in the Khazar Mountains. The Khazar slaves brought to the Islamic lands are mostly from here. So, there were a group of Pechenegs called the Khazarian Pechenegs. They lived in the area right next door to the Khazars, where the Magyars formerly dwelt at. For now, that is enough about the Pechenegs. The reason their history is important when discussing the Khazars is because they delivered the final blow to the Magyars, resulting in the Magyars migrating west into present-day Hungary. The Magyars played a pivotal role in the western flank of the Khazar state. The placement of the Magyars in this region inhibited the Rus from reaching the Khazar Khaganate. But after the Pechenegs drove the Magyars westward, the Khazar's western flank was now open to the Rus. And these events take us back to the history of the Rus, who eventually destroyed the Khazar state. We ended Rus history in 879 AD, when Varangian leader Rurik died. He was succeeded by his son, Oleg. The primary Russian chronicle tells us that Oleg sailed down the Dnieper River to the town of Kiev and executed 2 of his own men, Dur and Oskold. Oleg then united the Slavic tribes under his belt and turned them against the Khazars. In 911 AD, Oleg signed a treaty with the Byzantines that led to lucrative trading between the emerging state of the Rus and Byzantium. The Byzantines also had ties with the Khazars, whom around this same period they helped construct the fortress of Sarkel. Before we finish off the Khazars' history with the Rus, it is important that we pause here and discuss another event that took place during this period: the expedition of Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who was sent to the land of the Volga Bulgars to convert them to Islam. During this expedition, Ibn Fadlan took notes of the many nations and cultures he encountered. Although he did not encounter the Khazars, he did annotate what he heard of them and their influence of Judaism from the surrounding nations. We will discuss this event and the destruction of the Khazar state in the next episode. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episode.